That March evening in 1956, Ed Sullivan slammed his fist on the mahogany desk at CBS Studios in New York City. "I will not book that man on my show ever." His voice was ice-cold final. The 54-year-old host of America's most popular television show was talking about a 21-year-old singer from Mississippi who was causing an absolute sensation across the country, Elvis Presley. But what Ed Sullivan didn't know was that in just 4 months, he would not only book Elvis Presley on his show, he would do something on live television that would change the course of American culture forever. Before you hear this incredible story, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to witness is the moment when America's most conservative TV host faced the future and had to choose between his principles and his survival. To understand why this moment mattered so much, you need to understand who Ed Sullivan was and what his show represented in 1956 America. Ed Sullivan wasn't just a TV host, he was a cultural gatekeeper. He was the man who decided what was acceptable for American families to watch on Sunday nights. The Ed Sullivan Show, which aired at 8 p.m. every Sunday on CBS, was an institution. Families across America planned their weekends around it. Churches scheduled evening services to end before 8 p.m. so congregations could get home in time. It was the most watched show in America, reaching over 50 million viewers every week. If you appeared on Ed Sullivan's show, you were legitimate. You were approved. You were safe for America. Ed Sullivan himself was the embodiment of 1950s American values. He was stiff, formal, serious. He wore dark suits and spoke in a monotone voice that somehow commanded absolute respect. He never smiled much. He never joked around. He introduced acts with his signature phrase, "Really big show," and that was it. No warmth, no personality, just authority. And America loved him for it. Because in the 1950s, authority meant safety. Authority meant order. Authority meant knowing that the world made sense and that certain lines would never be crossed. Ed Sullivan was the guardian of those lines. But in early 1956, something was happening in America that Ed Sullivan couldn't control. A cultural earthquake was building, and at the center of it was a young man from Tupelo, Mississippi, who was about to change everything. Elvis Presley had been performing professionally for about 2 years. He'd started in Memphis playing small clubs and local radio shows. Then he'd been discovered by Sam Phillips at Sun Records. By 1955, Elvis had signed with RCA Records and released his first single, Heartbreak Hotel. The song went to #1, then Hound Dog, then Don't Be Cruel. Everything Elvis touched turned to gold. But it wasn't just the music that was causing a sensation. It was Elvis himself. The way he moved, the way he performed. Elvis didn't stand still at a microphone like traditional singers. He moved his whole body. He swiveled his hips. He dropped to his knees. He seemed to channel some kind of raw energy that had never been seen on stage before. And teenage girls went absolutely crazy. They screamed, they cried, they fainted. Their parents were horrified. Church leaders called Elvis the devil. Newspapers wrote editorials about the moral decay of American youth. Psychologists warned that rock and roll was a dangerous influence that would corrupt an entire generation. Ed Sullivan had watched all of this with growing alarm. He'd seen Elvis perform on the Milton Berle Show in June. The performance had caused a national scandal. Elvis had sung Hound Dog with such provocative movements that NBC received thousands of complaint letters. Newspapers across the country condemned the performance as obscene. The New York Times called it a display of vulgar exhibitionism. Religious leaders demanded that Elvis be banned from television, and Ed Sullivan, reading all of this, made his decision. He would never allow Elvis Presley on his show. Never. He told reporters on the record that Elvis represented everything wrong with modern entertainment. He said that his show would remain a bastion of good taste and family values. But then something happened that Ed Sullivan hadn't anticipated. His competitors started booking Elvis, first the Milton Berle Show, then Steve Allen. And when Elvis appeared on these shows, the ratings were astronomical. Steve Allen's July 1956 show featuring Elvis was the highest-rated program of the entire year. It crushed Ed Sullivan in the ratings that week. For the first time in years, the Ed Sullivan Show wasn't #1. And Ed Sullivan, for all his talk about principles and values, was also a businessman. He understood television. He understood that ratings meant survival, and that being #1 meant everything. Ed's producers came to him with the numbers. Mr. Sullivan, they said, we're losing viewers to Steve Allen. We're losing our dominance. If we don't book Elvis Presley, we're going to fall behind. Ed resisted. He argued. He insisted that there had to be another way. But the numbers didn't lie. Elvis Presley was the biggest star in America, and the Ed Sullivan Show couldn't afford to ignore him anymore. Finally, in late July 1956, Ed Sullivan made a decision that went against everything he'd said publicly for months. He would book Elvis Presley, but there would be conditions, strict conditions, non-negotiable conditions. Ed's team reached out to Elvis's manager, Colonel Tom Parker. The colonel negotiated an unprecedented deal. Elvis would appear 3 times for $50,000, more than Ed had ever paid any performer. But Ed drew one absolute line. The cameras will only show Elvis from the waist up. The first appearance was September 9, 1956. Ed Sullivan was recovering from a car accident, so Charles Lawton hosted. Over 60 million people watched one of the most watched TV events in American history. Ed Sullivan, watching from his hospital bed, saw the ratings and knew immediately what they meant. Like it or not, Elvis Presley had just become essential to his show's success. The second appearance was scheduled for October 28, 1956. This time, Ed Sullivan would be hosting. He'd recovered from his injuries and was back in command of his show. But the dynamic had changed. Elvis wasn't a curiosity anymore. He had proven he delivered the highest ratings of the year. Ed needed Elvis more than ever. October 28 arrived. Elvis was less nervous this time. He'd done the show before. He knew what to expect. But there was still an edge to the evening, because Elvis knew that Ed Sullivan had been one of his harshest critics. The show began. Ed Sullivan walked onto the stage to his usual thunderous applause. He did his opening remarks with his typical stiff formality. Then, as the evening progressed, it was time for Elvis's segment. Ed introduced him with professional courtesy, but without warmth. Elvis Presley, Ed said simply. Elvis came out and performed Don't Be Cruel Again, Love Me Tender, and Hound Dog. The studio audience went wild. The cameras stayed above the waist, but something was different this night. As Elvis performed, Ed Sullivan stood in the wings watching. Really watching. And what he saw wasn't a vulgar troublemaker corrupting American youth. What he saw was a young man who was incredibly talented, who worked hard, who was respectful to the crew, who said yes sir and no sir to everyone he met. Ed Sullivan had been in entertainment for decades. He'd seen thousands of performers, and he recognized something in Elvis that his prejudice had prevented him from seeing before. This wasn't a rebel trying to destroy American values. This was a kid from Mississippi who loved music and who had been given an extraordinary gift. After Elvis's performance, as the applause thundered through the studio, Ed Sullivan made a split-second decision that would change everything. He walked out onto the stage while Elvis was still standing there. Elvis, surprised, turned to face him. The audience, sensing something unexpected was about to happen, quieted down. Ed Sullivan looked at Elvis, then looked at the camera, and said something that no one watching could have predicted. I want to say to Elvis Presley and the country that this is a real decent fine boy. We've never had a pleasanter experience on our show with a big name than we've had with you. The studio audience erupted in applause, but what they didn't know was how significant this moment was. Ed Sullivan, the man who had publicly called Elvis vulgar, who had said he would never allow him on his show, who represented everything conservative and establishment about 1950s America, had just given Elvis Presley his seal of approval on live television in front of 60 million Americans. Elvis, stunned, managed to say, "Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. Thank you very much, sir." His voice cracked slightly with emotion. This wasn't just a nice compliment. This was legitimacy. This was the establishment saying that Elvis Presley was acceptable, that he wasn't dangerous, that parents didn't need to worry. In homes across the country, parents who had been horrified by Elvis suddenly saw him differently. If Ed Sullivan said he was a decent boy, then maybe he was. Ed Sullivan had never steered them wrong before. The impact of that moment was immediate and profound. Newspapers that had condemned Elvis started running more balanced coverage. Church leaders who had called him the devil toned down their rhetoric. Parents who had forbidden their daughters from listening to Elvis reconsidered. Elvis went from being a threat to being acceptable, from being dangerous to being safe. And it all happened because Ed Sullivan on live television called him a real decent fine boy. But perhaps the most interesting part is what happened behind the scenes after that second show. Elvis and Ed Sullivan had a private conversation in Ed's dressing room. "Mr. Sullivan," Elvis said, "I want to thank you for what you said out there. My mother was real upset by some of the things written about me. What you said tonight means the world to her." Ed looked at the young man. "Elvis, I owe you an apology. I judged you before I knew you. That was wrong of me." Elvis shook his head. "You don't owe me anything, sir. You gave me a chance." Despite everything, all the criticism, Elvis wasn't bitter. He was grateful, humble. He was exactly what Ed had told the country, a decent fine boy. The third Elvis appearance was January 6, 1957. Elvis performed with the same energy. The ratings were enormous. Ed again praised Elvis publicly. What's remarkable about this story isn't just that Ed Sullivan changed his mind about Elvis. It's how public and definitive that change was. Ed could have quietly booked Elvis without comment. He could have introduced him coldly and kept his distance. Instead, he used his platform and his authority to actively legitimize Elvis to the American public. He put his reputation on the line to tell America that their fears about Elvis were unfounded. Why did Ed Sullivan do this? There are several reasons. First, he was a businessman who understood that Elvis was good for his ratings. But it was more than that. Ed Sullivan was also someone who prided himself on discovering and promoting talent. Once he got past his prejudice, once he actually met Elvis and saw him perform up close, he recognized genuine talent and genuine character. Second, Ed Sullivan understood cultural change better than he let on. He'd been in entertainment long enough to see trends come and go. He understood that rock and roll wasn't going away. It wasn't a fad. It was the future. And if he wanted his show to remain relevant, he needed to embrace that future rather than fight it. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Ed Sullivan was moved by Elvis himself. By his humility, his respect, his gratitude. Elvis didn't fit the narrative that Ed had believed about him. When confronted with evidence that contradicted his prejudice, Ed had the integrity to change his mind, and to do so publicly. The impact of Ed Sullivan's acceptance of Elvis cannot be overstated. It changed how America viewed Elvis and rock and roll. Parents reconsidered their bands. Radio stations felt more comfortable playing his music. Ed Sullivan's endorsement gave Elvis mainstream legitimacy. Ed Sullivan's willingness to change his mind set an example for how America could navigate cultural change. The 1950s were a time of enormous tension. Everything seemed to be changing at once. Ed Sullivan chose adaptation over resistance. He recognized that Elvis, despite his unconventional style, wasn't actually a threat to American values. Elvis embodied hard work, respect for elders, and gratitude. Elvis never forgot what Ed Sullivan did for him. When Ed Sullivan called me a decent boy on national television, he changed how America saw me. Elvis said in 1970. When Elvis died in 1977, Ed Sullivan released a statement, "I was wrong about Elvis when I first encountered him. I judged him by appearance rather than who he actually was. I'm grateful I had the opportunity to correct that mistake publicly. He was a real decent fine boy." The story of Ed Sullivan and Elvis is about how we deal with cultural change and confront our prejudices. Ed could have remained stubborn, but he chose to investigate whether his prejudice was justified. When he discovered it wasn't, he had the courage to change his mind publicly. If this story moved you, hit subscribe and tell us. Have you ever completely changed your opinion about someone after getting to know them? Sometimes the most conservative person can become an agent of change by recognizing when prejudice blocks the truth.